Hello, I'm Roger Watson, Editor-in-Chief of Nurse Education and Practice, and in this session we're going to look at promoting integrity in research publication. What we're going to be concerned about essentially in the next 15 minutes or so is with publication ethics, or the ethics of publication. And I've probably already touched on this in previous sessions. This is very much an integral part of the publishing process these days. And it's really a responsibility of journals to make sure that authors know what the ethical standards are in case there are any doubts or in case there are any problems subsequently. And we normally point you towards a standard set of guidance, which I will refer to, or to a standard body of knowledge on research publication ethics, which we all use. All quality journals would refer to that. So what I'm talking about today is publication ethics. Now, this is a huge problem. As an editor-in-chief, and I've been an editor-in-chief for over 20 years, there's never a time when I'm not dealing with some kind of ethical transgression, misdemeanor. An author has done something wrong. It takes an inordinate amount of time to deal with, and it can have very serious consequences for the author. So it's very important that people like myself, editors-in-chief, and my colleagues do spread the word about publication ethics. In other words, we don't not only expect you to understand them and to learn about them, we positively promote them. So publication ethics has been an issue for a very long time, almost since publishing began, but we're much more acutely aware of it now. And of course, with online publishing, certain aspects of publication ethics have been easier to police or to monitor, as it were. So why do we need publication ethics? Well, why can't people just publish what they want, copy other people's work or whatever? Well, they can't. And what we need publication ethics for is really two things. One is so that the consumers of our research, which ultimately is the general public who may be benefiting from our clinical research or nursing education work or whatever, it's so that they can have some faith in what we do, so that they can trust it, basically. Of course, people make mistakes. That's obvious. But there should also be, as part of the ethical process, there should be a process for, as part of publication ethics, there should be processes for recognising when mistakes have been made and doing something about it. That's a slightly different issue. So, on the one hand, publication ethics is about ensuring and enhancing trust in medical, health, nursing research, and indeed in all academic research. The other side to it, which is just as important, and actually this is one of the very common problems, is to ensure that everybody who's been involved in that work is actually credited with that work. And actually, to make sure that people who weren't involved in it weren't credited with it, or aren't credited with it, and actually to make sure that everybody who's involved in with that research actually takes credit for it and doesn't stand back. What I mean to say is, if you've taken part in a research project and written up a paper, you should be an author because you're responsible for that work and you should be identified. And there aren't many instances where that would happen, where people wouldn't want to be an author if they've been involved, but it does happen occasionally. So what I'm talking about is trust on the one hand, and correct attribution of authorship on the other hand, and also mechanisms for making sure that authors in themselves are trustworthy. So I'm just going to, there isn't a great deal of time, but I'm just going to run through the 6 different aspects of publication ethics, okay? And if you want to know anything more about publication ethics, I strongly advise that you go to the web page of COPE, C-O-P-E, Committee on Publication Ethics. This was established around 1987, I think, by the British Medical Journal and the Lancet, but it's not just about medical research these days. And it was set up to ensure or enhance the integrity of clinical research. And really, this is the body which provides guidance worldwide across all disciplines for publication ethics. It's not a court, it's not a policing organisation, it's the responsibility of editors and publishers to take action if there's a ethical problem, but it does provide standardised ways of handling ethical problems. So I'd strongly advise you to take a look at that. It's got everything you need to know there about what I'm going to talk about next. So the 6 aspects of publication ethics that I'm going to use to address it, and these are the ways that are sort of a standard way of addressing publication ethics, are first of all duplication, and then plagiarism, and then falsification, and then fabrication, and then authorship, and conflict of interest. Those are the 6 things. Again, time is very limited, but I'm just going to say a little bit about each one. Duplication is publishing the same study twice, your study, your work, and it does happen. Sometimes people publish the same paper more than once. This can be done very deliberately. It can sometimes be done by people not realising that they shouldn't submit their paper to more than one journal at the same time. You shouldn't do that because you actually assign the copyright when you submit it. But some people do that. Then both journals accept it, and they don't want to admit that to one journal, oh, it was somewhere else, or they just forget, and 2 papers appear. Very, very serious indeed. And it's serious because it exaggerates the extent to which that author has had an influence on that field. So what I'm saying is you can't publish the same paper twice, generally speaking. You also shouldn't repeat large sections of previous papers. However, the Committee on Publication Ethics, to which I've already referred, has advised editors to be lenient about methods section, because methods sections are difficult not to duplicate. So don't worry too much about methods section. Don't try to make them identical, but we know that they're often the same. But duplicating large sections of papers is not really acceptable. The only time that you can publish the same paper more than once, for there are 2 instances. One is publishing in a different language, and the other is publishing in a different kind of journal. So some clinical studies, particularly in nursing, might be published in an international academic journal, but they might also be published in a local clinical journal that local nurses might read. That can be acceptable. The important thing is that you don't just do it, that you ask the original journal where the paper was published if you can do it, and you tell the recipient journals that this is what you've done, and if they both agree, then you're okay. And it should be pointed out in the subsequent journals that this was either published originally in English or it was already published in a different journal, and that keeps you in the clear, and it prevents the papers getting picked up more than once in a systematic review, which is very important indeed from the clinical perspective. So that's duplication. There is something else called salami slicing, which is similar to duplication, which means cutting studies up into lots of small studies. This is a more difficult one to tackle, and it's really a matter of judgment. But you shouldn't, every paper that you publish should be a discrete piece of work. Don't get into the habit of cutting it down into 2 small parts, because you can get into trouble that way. So that's first of all duplication. And just to warn you that if you've done a clinical trial with multiple outcomes, then you shouldn't really be publishing all of those outcomes separately without ensuring that the readership knows that that's what's happening. But sometimes that doesn't happen, and that's one of the points of registering studies, is that you identify your primary outcomes. So if you publish a secondary outcome, it should be identified as such. And I know authors within nursing who've got into very serious trouble, including losing their employment, being sacked for that kind of duplication. So it's very serious. Plagiarism is really quite simple. Plagiarism is using somebody else's ideas and passing it off as your own. So taking someone else's academic paper and putting your name on it and then publishing it, that would be plagiarism. plain and simple. But also stealing other people's ideas at any point in the research process could be plagiarism if they can prove it. But what we're concerned about as publishers and editors is people taking other people's work and passing it off as their own, either in whole or taking sections of other articles and putting them into their own without re-editing them or without acknowledging it properly. Sometimes it's just poor academic practice, but it will still be picked up and you will still be asked to explain or possibly correct it. And it can lead to retractions of papers. It can lead to loss of employment. These are very serious issues indeed under some circumstances. We do what we can, as I think I've said already, to detect similarity between papers, but similarity doesn't necessarily mean plagiarism. A paper could be 90% similar to other sources but not plagiarised, or it may be 10% similar and plagiarised. So we don't have a figure to give you that indicates what you can get away with. It's the nature of the similarity that matters. Again, time doesn't permit me to go into that in much detail. The next aspect is falsification of results, and that's making results look better than they are, ignoring outliers or playing about with images, or not admitting that patients were missing, for example, saying you had a 90% return rate when you only had 70%. Anything that makes your data look better than they are, which is not permitted, that's called falsification. On the other hand, fabrication, which is a different thing. Fabrication is just making results up, and it does happen. And people usually get caught because the numbers are just too incredible to believe. People will say we had exactly 10,000 people in our study. Well, that's impossible. You usually have 9,950 or something like that. People often get caught because they don't bother to make it even look credible. And it does happen. People just simply making data up. And in quantitative data, statisticians are often the people who detect this. Again, falsification can be by accident. Fabrication cannot be by accident. And again, very serious indeed, and will almost definitely lead to someone being removed from their employment, and probably not, even if they get employment elsewhere, might be blacklisted by a journal. It's a very serious thing indeed. Not very common, but it's common enough. So that's those are things to do with the content of the paper. That's duplication, plagiarism, falsification and fabrication. So that's 4 of the aspects of ethics dealt with. The next one is authorship. And again, I pity that we don't have time to go into this in more detail. But basically, authorship is about attributing the correct authors to the paper and not allowing somebody who wasn't actually involved in the work to be an author. I know that happens very commonly, sadly. We don't police this. We take it on trust that people have done the right thing. However, sometimes we get letters from an author or an academic who says, I should have been on that paper, but they haven't included me. Then we have to investigate. Very occasionally, we get letters which say that person should not have been on that paper, they had nothing to do with it. Likewise, we have to investigate that, and the outcomes can be very varied. Again, we don't have time to go into detail, but please make sure that you, if you've taken part in the work, you should be an author. If you're a leader of a team, make sure everyone gets attributed correctly. We don't care about the order of authorship. I've got nothing to say about that, and we do not care about the corresponding author. That is important to us as a way of corresponding about the paper, but it doesn't indicate any greater importance to us at all. So we're not concerned about these things. We have nothing to say about that. What we're concerned about is that everyone who did take part gets attributed properly, and anyone who didn't doesn't get attributed. So don't add people on just because they're important or senior. And the other way to make sure that you do the right thing with authorship is to sit down at the beginning of a project and decide who is going to be the author in which papers and in which order. There's lots of guidance available from different research integrity offices around the world about this. So the final point is a very complex and very lengthy point. We really could be here for half an hour or an hour talking about this. It's conflicts of interest, and we don't have time to go into them in a great deal of detail. But basically, a conflict of interest is anything, once a paper is published, that you haven't declared that somebody could then bring up and say, well, that person was influenced in the outcome of this paper because of some connection. And those connections could be financial, being paid by a drug company to do a clinical trial. They could be personal. You could be related to someone in that university. You could have a visiting professorship and be an editor, and you could be helping them to publish and not declaring it. So anything that you think might influence your interpretation of the results that someone may look at later on, you should declare. I know it sounds a strange thing to say, but never be afraid of declaring potential conflicts of interest, because it doesn't mean to say that a conflict of interest makes the paper inaccurate or makes your involvement wrong. What I'm saying is, if somebody subsequently suspects there's been a conflict of interest and you haven't declared it, that's when you might get into trouble. So do make sure that anything you think that someone may suspect your interpretation of the results, do make sure that you declare it. So those are the 6 aspects of publication ethics. I'd advise you strongly to go and read up more about them, particularly authorship and conflicts of interest. Just to recap, the 6 areas are duplication, plagiarism, falsification, fabrication, authorship, and conflicts of interest. So please make sure that you understand them, and I'm sure you won't deliberately, but please make sure that you don't do anything wrong regarding publication ethics. So I hope you found that useful, and I thank you very much for listening to me.